who lived and died around 2,000 years ago. Most were killed deliberately, many as human sacrifices, others as victims of murder, punishment, or of witchcraft. As science progresses, we are learning more about who these people were and how and why they died. What's for sure is that for many of the bog people, death must have been frightening and painful, and their final resting place a lonely one. The most common areas where bog bodies have been found are in continental Europe and Scandinavia, Britain and Ireland. The only other place in the world where they've been found is Windover Pond in Florida, this time an ancient cemetery where the 7,000-year-old bog brains of Native Americans have been uncovered. Bog bodies are mummies made by nature in conditions particular to bog waters. Beneath its spongy surface, a bog is made of 90% water. The water is filled with decaying plant matter, peat. The lack of oxygen and chemical properties of bogs prevents the growth of bacteria, which would normally break down the soft tissue and decay a body. Also, the acids and aldehydes in the bog water tan the skin in the same way cowhide is tanned to make leather. The flat, low-lying landscape of Holland, drained by a series of canals, makes it an ideal environment for bog bodies, many of which are now displayed in museums, such as the Drents Museum in the north of the country. The story of one of Holland's most famous bog bodies began in the spring of 1897. Two peat diggers were hard at work digging out the winter fuel from the fens in a small bog near the hamlet of Iddy. One of the men came across this frightening sight. Hideous face of the Iddy girl. Her mouth contorted as if in a last scream, her head twisted to one side, her skin dark and shriveled. But it was her red hair that really spooked the men. They thought they had unearthed a demon and fled. The Iddy girl was on display in Germany at the Landers Museum in Hanover with a collection of other amazing bog bodies as part of a 5-year world tour, which takes in Holland, Canada, and the United States. Hanover in northern Germany is a grand and elegant city, proudly displaying its fine, rich, and varied architecture to residents and visitors alike. No trip to Hanover would be complete without a visit to the Landers Museum, the temporary home for numerous bog bodies. British archaeologist and bog body expert Professor Miranda Green has come to Hanover to take a look at the Iddy girl for the first time. She's been studying her and the circumstances of her death for many years. This is quite a moment for Miranda.
Wow, it's incredible to see her face to face for the first time. She's so small and yet so incredibly lifelike.
Half of the Iddy girl's hair had been shaved. She had been strangled by a 7-foot-long band which had been wound around her neck 3 times and tied with a slip knot, tightened until her life was squeezed out of her.
It's an amazing thought to think that she was killed, strangled, the rope is still there around her neck, which makes it very evocative. You can tell that she died violently. And when we think that she was only 16 years old, it really does give one to think.
She was strangled, and then her body was laid in the marsh. But this was no murder or punishment. This was a case of human sacrifice, a gift to the gods in the times of great crisis. The reason that this 16-year-old girl was chosen above all others to go to the gods may have been because she was no ordinary girl. She suffered an obvious disability. X-rays showed that she had scoliosis, or curvature of the spine, and she was no more than 4.5 feet tall. Her right foot was swollen, indicating that she placed most of her weight on that side.
She would have been very visible in the landscape, walking with a peculiar lurching gait, and that would have marked her out as being peculiar, perhaps even touched by the gods. We mustn't think of these people as perhaps being, pariahs or parasites on society. They may have been regarded as blessed by the gods because they were special, they were different.
And so, being different, special, singled out the itty girl for this awful but necessary event. The event was inevitably horrific, but she may have been given something to help her cope with her natural fear of death.
We know from literary sources that some of these people were maybe drugged or intoxicated with liquor before they died. So the whole thing, she may have gone to her death in a kind of, almost on a high, as it were.
Despite her possible drugged state, death must have been terrifying once strangulation began. Yes, she was chosen because she was special, and yes, an honored messenger to the gods, but the fear must have been enormous.
We're dealing with a very theatrical type of killing. The whole community would be involved, perhaps gathering around watching her die.
This theater of horror would not have been a frequent occurrence. It was a drastic measure only taken in times when the community was threatened, say, by famine, war, or disease.
This would be something which maybe only took place once in 30 or 40 years. So it would have been special, it would have been horrifying, but also cathartic. The whole village might have felt purified and cleansed by this one act.
To see the remains of the young woman who went through such a frightening death may be a little repulsive for most of us, but for the archaeologist, it's a thrill.
What's interesting about her is that this is as close to getting face to face with one's past as one's going to get. Actually looking at this girl just gives one such a buzz.
Looking at the Tollen man of Denmark face to face is enough to give anyone a buzz, considering the remarkable preservation over 2,000 years or more. The peat has mummified his face so perfectly, you can even see the tiny wrinkles around his eyes and the reddish stubble on his chin. You could almost imagine the man waking up and speaking to you.
The tall man's face is very expressive. His survivors has arranged him exactly like a sleeping person. They also bent his arm and his legs exactly like a sleeping child when they put him out in the bog. If he was a man they have executed because of some kind of criminality, I think that they would just have thrown him out. And that demonstrates for me that he was a sacrifice.
In Iron Age times, these strange marshes were chosen as places of sacrifice because of their strange quality, neither solid ground nor water. So the Iron Age peoples thought bogs held a particular religious significance as the entrance to the world of the gods, the other world, the perfect place to offer their most precious gift, a human life. The Tollen man was once such a gift and is still considered a gift to the Danes. He was found in a bog in Jutland, Denmark's main island. It's a place of wild marshlands, watery fjords and inlets, and well-renowned museums such as the Silkeborg Museum, where the Tollen man now resides. Danish archaeologist Niels Linderup has come to Silkeborg from Copenhagen to undertake some state-of-the-art scientific analysis of the 2,500-year-old bog body.
Tollen man really is one of the most spectacular finds of Danish antiquity. And I think Tollen man means a lot to me, but probably to a lot of people, because it really is so well preserved. You can actually see the expression, the eyelashes, and the stubble, which allows us to really get a glimpse of the person, the actual person, 2,000 years across time.
It doesn't take a genius to deduct from the rope around the Tullen man's throat that this was the instrument of death. But what scientists don't know yet is whether or not he was hanged by the rope or it was used to drag him along the ground to break his neck. Dr. Linnerup's new science may help to answer that. Very gingerly, the team of scientists removes the bulletproof glass casing that has protected the Tullen man for 50 years. All that remains intact in this body is the remarkably preserved head and his feet. The body you see on display is a cast of how it was when it was first found in 1950, but poor preservation techniques in the early days sadly resulted in the disintegration of the fragile torso. Under the watchful eye of the ever-careful curator Christian Fischer, the precious remains of the Tullen man are transported by police convoy to Aarhus Hospital a few miles away. This rare event has excited a frenzy among the Danish media in recognition of the Tullen man as an important part of their heritage. This is the first time the head will be CAT scanned.
This allows us to exactly see the state of preservation and the state of the tissues and perhaps also even get a bit closer analysis on cause of death in terms of hanging and the damage to the internal organs and the throat and so on.
The excitement of the scientists as they gather around to see the results is palpable.
And we saw a very well preserved brain. The brain is excellently preserved, so it's going to be very well preserved internal structures. So it's going to be very beautiful to visualize some of these things.
The CAT scan allows the imaging of every facet of the brain, which can be held on computer for future scientific analysis without further disruption of the Tullen man himself. The next test is using an endoscope to see inside the skull. The scientists are amazed to find that they can actually film this 2,000-year-old brain. Apart from identifying scars or tattoos, the infrared and UV light processes may reveal how the Tullen man was killed, by hanging or strangulation.
The thing is, if he's been hanged, which means the noose would kind of go up in an inverted V, or he was strangulated by simply, standing or lying, and then there would be a circular furrow.
The mood among the scientists is more somber as the fate of the Tullen man, of whom they all have a certain affection and respect, becomes clear.
Well, I think we are talking a hanging. He has been hanged. It's not just a strangulation with a piece of rope. He's been actually strung up, hanged. That would explain the furrows, and because it needs his body weight to get that kind of pattern.
For the first time, modern apparatus has accumulated a huge number of images of the Tullen man's anatomical features and has confirmed theories surrounding his death. Through new science, 2,000-year-old bodies, fortunately preserved by the chemical reactions of the peat bogs, are with us today to be studied and analyzed.
We're looking at a person who died more than 2,400 years ago, and he looks exactly like us. He could be standing next to us in the shopping line or whatever. He's obviously human, he's obviously one of us.
It's incredible to think that a man who lived 2.5 millennia ago should be so like us. But another discovery of human remains, found in a bog 3 times older than the Tullen man, has given us even more amazing insights. Cape Canaveral, southern Florida, 220 square miles of undisturbed bog on the outskirts of the NASA launch site were to reveal to archaeologists the sophistication of some of the first Americans. Construction worker Steve Vanderjagt was clearing a path through a marshy area known as the Windover Bog. Then something strange, unusual caught his eye in the bucket of his mechanical digger.
Found it to be a little strange because you don't see a lot of rocks and stones here coming out, and so I jumped off to take a look to see what it was that I did pick up out of there. And as I turned it around, it was looking at me.
What Steve had uncovered was a skull. This was to prove to be one of the most important archaeological sites in the United States and one of the largest in the country. Professor Glenn Doran arrived in Windover to excavate the bog. He was stunned by what he saw.
There was a relatively small, little nasty water black pond, and at first glance, it didn't look like a particularly inviting place for an archaeological site. But then we got out and we started walking up and down, and within just a few minutes, we started seeing clusters of human skeletal material.
Radiocarbon dating revealed that the bodies were far older than any other human remains found in Florida before.
When we got the word back that the materials were over 7,000 years old, I mean, we were really walking on clouds. I mean, it just unbelievable. It exceeded our expectation.
Cocooned in this peaty grave lay the remains of hundreds of men, women, and children of all ages. And what was more extraordinary was that their brains had been preserved by the bog. Brains that belonged to some of the very first people to step foot in the Americas. Analysis revealed that these brains were as well developed as modern brains. These ancient Americans were far from primitive.
An 8,000-year-old human brain is a fully modern human. There is no difference. The thought process would have been the same. Although these brains are perhaps twice as old as the pyramids, this is modern man.
Then they made another significant discovery. Attached to the bodies themselves were pieces of fabric, perhaps shrouds, indicating a ritual burial. This wasn't a chance scattering of bodies. This was a cemetery.
When someone died in the area, you probably wrapped them in a garment or a blanket. There was probably some sort of a, if you will, a procession to the pond. Certainly, the next of kin would be there.
The body was placed beneath the water of the bog and held under the water by driving stakes in the corners of the fabric so that the body was pinned to the bottom of the bog.
Burial patterns around the world are very, very different, but they all have a common thread in a sense. So these people would have felt all of the same emotions that you and I feel when a loved one, when a neighbor, when a friend passes away. It is part of the human condition. It's part of human nature.
The Windover burials are not evidence of ritual human sacrifice as performed by the Celts of Northern Europe. What the cemetery does reveal is the spiritual enlightenment of some of the first Americans. Driving across these country roads of Holland, it's hard to imagine that these barren wildernesses were once populated by people whose only source of fuel was peat, the very ground on which they stood. Peat extraction became a successful industry during the 19th and 20th centuries, and it was during this period that the mass excavation of northern European bog bodies took place. One can imagine the shock of the peat diggers going about their work on unearthing the remains of a human body. But imagine unearthing two bodies. The Veerdinger couple were found lying side by side on their backs, one body with its arm under the other. The human shape is hard to detect because of the pressure of the soil over time and little remains of the heads.
Well, what we got here is a pair of bog bodies, and this is a quite unique find because you rarely find bog bodies in pairs. So it's very special. And one thing which is very special also is that they lie in a position which is very carefully laid down. So you can quite clearly see here the hand of one bog body and his arm stretching out underneath the other one, giving the impression that it was carefully laid down. So it's really that they, you can say that they have been put there deliberately. It's not that they had an accident or so, they drowned in the peat or whatever. They have been put in this position.
When they were first discovered in 1904, it was assumed because they were found in embrace that they were married or lovers, and they were given the nicknames Mr. and Mrs. Vanderpeet, the supposed husband's arm being in a gesture of protection or affection. But recent analysis has overturned that theory.
And it was only discovered in 1990 that on the basis of the stubbles on the chin of this bug body, that they found out that this was also a male, and it was recently confirmed by the DNA analysis.
But why would these two men be buried together in this contrived position? They could have been brothers in arms, warriors who were ambushed by an enemy, killed and buried in the bog. Unless this was a punishment for what the ancients might deem shameful behavior. Roman commentator Tacitus comments on the treatment of criminals during the Iron Age, which would fit in with the fate of the Virdinger men.
The punishment varies to suit the crime. The traitor and deserter are hanged on trees. The coward, the shirker, and the disreputable of body are drowned in miry swamps under a cover of wattle hurdles. The distinction in the punishments implies that deeds of violence should be paid for in the full glare of publicity, but the deeds of shame should be suppressed.
Does the remote burial in a bog indicate that the Virdinger men committed a deed of shame that needed to be suppressed? The embrace again raises the question of their relationship. Perhaps they were homosexual lovers, and homosexuality was considered shameful by some tribes in this part of Northern Europe.
Among the German tribes, homosexuality was considered to be very shocking, a kind of transgression of moral laws, and would have been severely punished.
But the real relationship between the Virdinger men is still a matter for conjecture.
We do not have any indication that they were lovers, but it might have been, but it might just as well have been father and son, might have been two brothers, just two friends, having no sexual relation whatsoever. We don't know anything about that.
One further piece of evidence, however, suggests strongly that there was a ritual element to the death of the Virdinger men. The man on the right has been stabbed in the abdomen. These are his entrails that have emerged from the wound.
You can see here in this region there is a real cut and all the intestines coming out, so they must have been stabbed in some sort of a way. But we really think that it was killed deliberately and that it was a sort of ritual killing before putting them in the bog.
We know from classical writers that the Druids used entrails to predict the future. And it may very well be that this particular unfortunate person was used as a kind of predictor of the future.
What's a puzzle is the reason for the double sacrifice and the relationship between these two men. Brothers, soldiers, lovers, their story remains a mystery. Another Iron Age mystery, alongside the Virdinger couple at the Landers Museum in Hanover, is this haunting tortured frame. Red Franz, so called because of his striking red hair, was found in 1900 on a raised bog in Bortangermoor, an area between Holland and Germany. There was nothing to explain the cause of his death. Nothing until the body was turned over from the face-down position he had been found in. His throat had been cut.
We can't know whether Red Franz was sacrificed or not, but we think maybe there was something special about his death.
Sacrifice or murder? Unlike other clear-cut cases, Red Franz displayed no immediate signs of ritual killing. Forensic analysis revealed a bending of this upper leg bone, indicating that he had spent much time on horseback. Perhaps he was a warrior killed in combat. His collarbone had been broken, and he had been shot by an arrow, but both injuries had healed during his lifetime and have nothing to do with his death. The position of his arms indicates a typical reflex if the throat was being cut, It seems that unlike most bog bodies of the Iron Age, Red Franz may not have been sacrificed, but murdered.
He was a horseman. That means that he was somebody who was really probably quite important, because owning a horse means that you can afford a horse. And he may have been a sacrificial killing because he was of such high status, but we mustn't rule out the fact that he may just have been some kind of criminal, transgressed the rules of his community and paid the ultimate price.
Schleswig, a picturesque town in northern Germany with its lofty spires and quaint houses, lies on a watery river inlet. The Grand City Museum is now home to the Windaby Girl, whom Miranda Green has come to see for the first time as part of her ongoing research. Peat cutters discovered this amazing bog body in 1952 on a country estate just outside the town.
Gosh, she looks very young, just lying there. She's looks about 12, and she looks so peaceful, and yet it's almost certain that she led to a rather dreadful death. By drowning, she must have been terrified.
A high proportion of Iron Age sacrifices were pubescent girls like Windaby here.
She was perhaps an adolescent on the verge of womanhood, not quite woman, not quite child, and maybe that was the reason why she was chosen for sacrifice at that time, because that kind of person is very powerful. She's virginal, and that gives her power. She's on the threshold of womanhood, so that kind of double state may have given her a special significance and may indeed account for her death.
Miranda is convinced that the blindfold found around the Windaby girl's eyes is further evidence of this special significance within the community.
I like to think that maybe she was some kind of seer, a soothsayer, a shaman perhaps, who had a blindfold to symbolize her ability for second sight.
The Windaby girl then may have been singled out to act as a messenger to the gods precisely because she had the power of second sight. And there is further evidence to back up this theory.
She has a birch staff in her hand, which may have meant that she had some kind of authority in some way. And we can point to numerous anthropological parallels of people, adolescent girls particularly, who were chosen to be the priestesses of their communities.
One peculiar feature of this burial is that the Windaby girl's head had been half shaved before she died. This would tie in with the theory that, contrary to the idea that she was a highly honored priestess, the Windaby girl was killed as a punishment for playing around with someone else's husband. Archaeologists became excited when soon after the discovery of the Windaby girl's body on a country estate in northern Germany, a second body was found very close by, that of an older man. Little was preserved except his skin, but modern tongues began to wag. Could he have been the girl's adulterous lover? And was this the reason for her shaved hair?
Shaved hair seemed to show in the direction of a sexual crime. And maybe they had a love affair with each other, maybe even adultery. And that might have been the reason why she might have been killed and buried in the bog.
For 50 years, archaeologists interpreted the burial of these two bodies in such close proximity as punishment for their illicit affair.
But this spring we got radiocarbon dates which show that the girl was buried anyhow in the middle of the 1st century AD and the man the 3rd century BC. So the love story is gone. There's nothing. This couldn't be possible.
So our fertile modern imaginations that had concocted a great love story had to accept that this was no Iron Age seduction.
From my point of view, I think she didn't seduce anyone in the Iron Age. It's not needed, this hypothesis. I think she seduced some archaeologists in the 20th century.
Miranda remains convinced that the Windaby girl was a special person, a shaman, the ultimate gift from her community to the gods.
It could be that because she was an important person in the community, she was sacrificed to be the ultimate sacrifice, if you like, to make sure that the gods listened.
The whole community would have gathered to the gods, a precious gift of their priestess. The girl may have been led out to the bog accompanied by chanting, singing, and drumming.
And then then perhaps the whole village would accompany her to the edge of the bog. We can imagine her feeling of complete horror, and then somebody would be chosen to lead her out into the marsh, and then she was laid down, she was drowned.
Her tranquil figure today tells us much about the violence of her premature death at the hands of her community. But there are other bog bodies